Truistery Vibes warmly welcomes all our beloved listeners. We're so glad to see you again in our familiar time slot.
Today,
Truistery Vibes brings you a brand new story, one that we hope will touch your heart and stay with you. As you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing the quote or moment that left the deepest impression on you. Wishing you a wonderful and meaningful listening experience. Thalia Harper had always felt the pull of two worlds. On one hand, there was her own restless spirit, an artist's soul born to explore, to question, to chase horizon after horizon. On the other, there was the gentle but persistent urging of her mother, Calliope, whose expectations weighed on her like the heavy Colorado sky. Ever since Thalia returned home to Boulder after graduating from the University of Colorado, Calliope had made her intentions crystal clear. Settle down first, her mother would say. Voice soft but firm, and then you can pursue all your dreams. Settle down, according to Calliope, meant marrying Orion Sterling, a man whose name belonged more to myth than to the bustling streets of Pearl Street. At 32, Orion owned a handcrafted ceramic studio tucked between the vibrant murals and microbreweries of downtown Boulder. His reputation for quiet reliability, never missing a market demonstration, always delivering custom orders on time, gave Calliope confidence that this was the son-in-law her family deserved. Thalia knew better than anyone how genuine Orion's kindness was. It had first revealed itself long before she ever returned to Boulder. Back when she was a freshman at the university, bright-eyed and homesick, she'd stepped off the late bus at that deserted stop near the studio after a grueling midterm. The sky had cracked open minutes later in a sudden spring downpour, and there, leaning against his workbench, was Orion with a single forest green umbrella. Without a word, he offered it to her. There were other moments, too. The crisp bottled water he handed her at her final sculpture critique when her throat had gone dry. The small, neatly folded note he slipped through her studio door the morning she learned she'd been accepted to a prestigious East Coast art residency. Always thoughtful, always respectful of her space. He never once asked for anything in return. But Thalia also remembered heartbreak. She remembered the year she fell for Rowan Callahan, a charismatic musician from Seattle whose passion burned bright and fast and burned just as quickly to embers. After that painful goodbye, she promised herself she would never again trust love to something so fleeting. Calliope seized on Thalia's vulnerability immediately. Orion cares for you in ways Rowan never could, her mother would remind her over late-night cups of chamomile tea. He's steady, dependable, ready to build a life with you. Every family gathering at the historic farmhouse, a place where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose like silent sentinels, became a stage for this gentle persuasion. Whenever Orion arrived, clad in his well-worn denim jacket, hands still flecked with clay, Calliope's face would light up with approval. Thalia felt caught between her mother's earnest hope and her own lingering doubts. At first, she'd avoided seeing Orion beyond polite smiles and courteous thanks. She threw herself into redesigning the sunroom for her mother's new yoga studio, redecorating her boyfriend's old college apartment, and hosting film nights with her soon-to-be former classmates. Yet every time she walked past the ceramic studio on her way to the farmer's market, she'd catch a glimpse of Orion's silhouette through the window, his hands shaping clay into vessels that seemed to hold something more than water. Sometimes from inside the shop, she'd hear the bell above the door jingle as he stepped out, offering to carry her tote bag when her arms were full of groceries. Still, she resisted. Thalia reminded herself that a life of quiet stability, even with someone as kind as Orion, felt like trading her wings for a cage. She had stories to write, canvases to paint, roads to travel. Why give that up now? And yet, despite her reservations, a strange comfort had begun to nestle in her chest whenever Orion's name floated on her mother's lips. His presence wasn't loud or intrusive. It was as soothing as the wind rustling aspen leaves outside her childhood window. In calls home, Calliope would casually mention Orion's latest pottery exhibition or how he'd rigged a small kiln to run entirely on solar power. Thalia found herself listening, imagining him there in his studio, his brow furrowed in concentration, lost in the simple perfection of form and function. By the time spring's first crocuses peeked through still frosty ground, Thalia realized something surprising. She missed him, not in the hollow, desperate way she'd missed Rowan, but in a soft, settling way, like the steady glow of the sun after a long, dark winter. Yet even as this realization grew, so did the tension between duty and desire. Every time she caught her mother's hopeful smile, she felt both warmth and a squeeze of compulsion. That is how her world stood at the beginning of this story, balanced on a knife's edge between the life she thought she wanted and the one that waited quietly for her acceptance. Orion's gentle courtship continued, unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by the two people who mattered most, the mother who believed in his promise and the daughter who struggled to believe in hers. And so Thalia found herself waking each morning with that same question weighing on her mind. Could love be as real and enduring as clay fired true in Orion's kiln? Or would her heart, like an unfired piece, crack under pressure? The answers lay ahead, shaped by every kind act and every uneasy glance, by every unspoken word in a love story that was only just beginning. The sun had just cleared the jagged peaks of the Flatirons when Thalia Harper stepped onto her back porch, coffee cup in hand, and watched the sky blush orange. It was a morning like countless others, yet today it felt significant. Behind her, the sanctuary of her childhood home hummed with domestic life. Her mother, Calliope, humming softly as she arranged fresh lavender in a vase. Her father, Marcus, tinkering in the garage. But in for weeks, she had danced on the edge of a decision that would shape the next chapter of her life. On one side lay the memory of heartbreak. Rowan Callahan's impassioned farewell when he left Seattle to tour with his band, promising the moon and vanishing like stardust. On the other lay the steady promise of Orion Sterling. Reliability carved into every gentle gesture, every kiln-fired vessel he crafted. All her life, Thalia's instinct had been to follow her own compass, adventure, creativity, freedom. She had painted one sunset after another in her mind, each a burst of vivid possibility. Marriage had never been part of that vision, at least not so soon, and certainly not to a man whose quiet devotion felt foreign next to her past passion. Yet something had shifted in these past months. Grief over her miscarriage had hollowed her out, leaving a tender space that longed for quiet instead of excitement. Nights she once spent sketching constellations had been replaced by tossing and turning, her mind replaying calls from her mother reminding her that life waited for no one. Thalia, love isn't only in great fireworks, Calliope would say. It's in the soft embers that keep you warm on a cold night. That morning, Thalia returned to the kitchen to find Orion already there. He was dressed in his familiar dark jeans and a slate-gray Henley shirt flecked with clay dust, proof that he'd stopped by the studio before sunrise. He looked up from the counter where he'd begun laying out his own coffee ritual, freshly ground beans, just 2 scoops, hot water poured in a precise spiral. "Morning," Orion said, offering her a steaming mug. His voice was calm, steady, like the first breath of dawn. "Morning," she replied, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. The curve of the mug fit perfectly, as if he had crafted it for her comfort. They moved to the small inset bench by the window, miles of foothills stretching beyond the back lawn. Orion slid in beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. No grand declarations, no demands, just shared silence and the aroma of roasted coffee beans. Thalia took a deep breath, feeling the crisp mountain air mix with warmth in her lungs. "I'm thinking," she began, her voice trailing as if unsure how to continue. Orion turned to her, his brow lifting in gentle encouragement. "I know," he said simply. The honesty of his response settled around her like a soft shawl. She could speak truthfully here, without fear. "It's just," she swallowed, searching for the right words. "After everything, I don't want another roller coaster. I've lost too much. Maybe what I need is stability, something that doesn't feel like it could vanish on tour." Orion nodded, keeping his tone light but attentive. "I understand." Thalia looked at him, really looked, for the first time beyond the gathering shadows of doubt. She saw more than just his calm eyes and careful smile. She saw a partner who had offered kindness without strings, who had shown up when she needed him most, who had never asked her to become someone she wasn't. She exhaled slowly. I want that with you. I want a life that's basic sometimes. A home where mornings look like this. Orion's lips curved into a soft grin. Nothing basic about this moment. They sat together in mutual silence, letting the idea take root. For Thalia, it felt less like surrendering her freedom and more like choosing a different kind of adventure, one that didn't roar with fireworks but glowed with steady light. Later that afternoon, she walked through Boulder's Pearl Street Market, earbuds tucked away so she could simply observe the way families strolled by hand in hand, the vendor offering her a sample of honey-infused goat cheese, the distant notes of a busker's fiddle. All of it felt sweeter when she knew someone would be waiting for her at home. That evening, Calliope prepared a celebratory dinner, a simple menu of rosemary roasted chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and mixed greens from their garden. As Thalia set the table, her mother watched her with bright eyes. So, Calliope asked, voice barely above a whisper. The single candle flickering between them cast warm pools of light. Thalia sat and reached for her mother's hand. I'm ready, she said, and each word felt anchored in conviction. Calliope smiled, tears glistening. Then let's make it official, she said, raising a glass of sparkling cider. A week later, beneath the hawthorn tree in their backyard, its branches just beginning to bud, Thalia stood in a simple ivory wrap dress. Orion faced her in a tailored navy blazer and crisp khakis. Their circle of family and close friends formed a small, supportive crowd. Thalia's heart pounded not with fear, but with a curious excitement, like the first gentle breeze before a calm summer rain. When Orion gently took her hands, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles, Thalia saw in his eyes the unwavering promise she had chosen. In that moment, the world felt right. She would not be shackled. She would be free, free to build an art studio in the sunroom, free to travel when opportunity called, free to paint again, this time alongside someone who valued her dreams as much as his own. As they exchanged vows that spoke of partnership, patience, and faithfulness, Thalia realized that choosing calm over chaos was not compromise, but clarity. Love, she discovered, could be a harbor as much as a wildfire. By the time they kissed, petals drifting down like slow snow, her future stretched before her. Not an uncharted wilderness, but a garden to cultivate together. And in that knowledge, Thalia found a peace she had never known before, and an unexpected thrill in the promise of ordinary days that would, in their own quiet way, become extraordinary. The ferry's engine thrummed beneath their feet as Thalia Harper and Orion Sterling crossed the Emerald Channel toward the San Juan Islands. Salt air mingled with the sweet scent of fir trees, and gulls cried overhead like distant laughter. Thalia pressed her forehead to the cool rail, closing her eyes to feel each shudder of the vessel, each promise of something new. At her side, Orion offered his hand, warm, steady, reminding her that wherever she went, this journey would be theirs together. They'd chosen a small cottage on Orcas Island, perched on a rocky bluff overlooking Crescent Beach. When they stepped inside, the late afternoon sun fell in honeyed squares across the hardwood floor. Orion flicked on a brass lantern, and the soft glow revealed hand-carved beams, a stone hearth, and a view of salt water lapping against bleached driftwood just beyond the picture window. I thought you'd like the view, he said, dropping his overnight bag. His voice was quiet but bright, carrying the same warmth Thalia had come to trust. She turned, leaning into him. It's perfect. That evening, they unpacked in companionable silence, Orion stacking mismatched china in the cabinet, Thalia arranging wildflowers in a chipped vase. When everything felt settled, Orion drew 2 glasses from the cabinet. He poured sparkling cider they'd picked up in Bellingham, the bubbles dancing like miniature stars. They clinked glasses in the low light, and Thalia felt a contentment she hadn't known for years. Outside, the sky deepened to indigo. Orion led her onto the little porch, where a wooden swing waited, its chains creaking gently. They sat side by side, cider in hand, shoulders touching. In the hush, Thalia noticed the small things. The way Orion's hair caught the lantern light, the soft line of his jaw, the calm rhythm of his breathing. "Here's to first mornings," he said softly. "And last nights," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. The next morning arrived in a chorus of seabirds and distant foghorns. Thalia awoke before the cottage stirred, the world tinted in pale pink. She slipped out of bed, paddling barefoot across the warm floorboards to the porch. Orion lay behind her, curled under the patchwork quilt, his face relaxed in sleep. She poured herself a mug of strong coffee from the little percolator on the stove, then returned outside. Mug in hand, she settled onto the swing, listening to the tide's gentle pulse. A few minutes later, Orion joined her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He wore only pajama bottoms, his shirt draped over one shoulder. "Good morning," he murmured, leaning around to kiss her cheek. "Good morning," she answered, holding up her mug. "Coffee." He accepted it with a grateful grunt and wrapped an arm around her. They sat in silence, sharing warmth and caffeine while the sun climbed, painting waves in molten gold. When the air warmed, Thalia suggested a walk along the beach. They slipped on sandals and carried mugs down a sandy path lined with spruce and salal bushes. Beneath their feet, pebbles clicked and seaweed smelled of brine. Orion paused at a tide pool, kneeling to show Thalia a cluster of ochre sea stars clinging to barnacle-encrusted rocks. "Look how they hold on," he said, "no matter how rough the tide gets." She smiled, thinking of how he had clung to her through her grief, through every doubt. "You're like a sea star," she teased, leaning to touch his shoulder. "Steady, unshakable." He stood and offered her his hand. "Race you to the driftwood stump?" She accepted with a laugh, and they ran, sandals flapping, laughter echoing across the rocks. At the stump, they collapsed, breathless, holding hands and grinning like children. That afternoon, they kayaked around a sheltered cove. Orion guided their tandem kayak through crystalline water, Thalia marveling at schools of silver fish darting beneath the hull. At one point, a seal popped its head nearby, eyeing them with bemused curiosity before diving again. When fatigue set in, they drifted into a quiet inlet and shared a picnic of oat cakes, local cheese, and crisp apple slices. "Life could be like this every day," Thalia said, leaning against Orion's shoulder. "It should," he replied, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "But we'll take what we can get." As dusk fell, they returned to the cottage, sun-kissed and tired. Orion filled the clawfoot tub with hot water scented by lavender soap he'd brought from Boulder. Thalia slipped in first, summoning bubbles with her fingertips. Orion joined her, and they sank beneath the suds, letting the warmth ease tired muscles. His arms encircled her, and she melted against him, safe in his quiet strength. Afterward, they lounged in robes on the porch, sharing a plate of blackberry cobbler he'd baked earlier that day. Orion fed Thalia the first bite, a dollop of warm fruit and crumbly crust, and she moaned softly at the sweetness. "There it is," he said, eyes twinkling. "The sound of pure happiness." She wiped a smear of cobbler from her chin and leaned in to kiss him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He smiled, brushing his lips across her cheek. "For everything, sweetheart." Night settled in with a sky full of stars, unpolluted by city lights. Orion retrieved a blanket and led Thalia to a grassy knoll behind the cottage. They lay side by side, the blanket wrapped around their shoulders, heads turned skyward. Thalia pointed out constellations she'd once painted, Cassiopeia, Draco, the Big Dipper. Orion traced them with his finger, nodding as she spoke. In that quiet communion, they shared stories of childhood wonder, of hopes for the future, perhaps a small gallery attached to a studio, or a second home where Thalia could teach weekend art workshops for kids. The air hummed with possibilities as steady as Orion's heartbeat next to hers. Before sleep claimed them, Thalia pressed her palm against Orion's chest, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing. "Promise me," she said softly, "that we'll carry this peace back home." He opened his eyes and looked at her in the starlight. "I promise." When the chill finally drove them inside, they fell asleep in each other's arms, the promise of a new dawn tucked between whispered dreams. By the time they packed their bags to leave the island, both felt changed, rewritten in subtle, profound ways by these days of unhurried kindness and shared wonder. Thalia's laughter had returned, her creativity rekindled by the rhythms of tides and the patterns of sea stars. Orion's devotion had deepened, his heart buoyed by the trust she now freely gave. As they boarded the ferry back to Boulder, Thalia slipped her hand into Orion's and squeezed. The ferry's horn bellowed, and Thalia looked out once more at the receding coastline, at cliffs and coves now alive with memory. "I think," she said, voice firm with newfound certainty, "I'm ready for the next chapter, wherever it leads us." Orion smiled, eyes bright as the dawn they'd once watched together. "Me too," he replied. And so they sailed forward, carrying the warmth of their honeymoon, the gentle rhythms of dawn, the hush of moonlit tides, back into the life they would build side by side. The morning sun in Boulder carried a promise of new beginnings, warmth spilling over red rock cliffs, sunlight dancing on dew-kissed grass. Thalia Harper woke with a flutter of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Today was her first doctor's appointment to confirm what she'd suspected for weeks. She was pregnant. She dressed in soft linen, heart pounding as she scribbled a quick note for Orion, already at his studio, asking him to meet her afterward. Every step toward the clinic felt buoyed by hope. When she arrived, the receptionist greeted her with a gentle smile, offering a tissue once she'd shared her news through trembling lips. In the ultrasound room, Thalia lay back on the exam table, fingers curled around the stethoscope bedrail. The sonographer applied cool gel to her belly and pressed the probe against her skin. A hush fell, broken only by the rhythmic beeps of the machine. "There it is," the technician murmured, eyes bright. "Heartbeat looks strong." Thalia closed her eyes, letting joy wash through her like a sunrise. She could almost feel tiny arms and legs kicking inside her, a life in its earliest bloom. For weeks, she'd felt morning nausea fade into a quiet glow of possibility. She pictured teaching her child to paint at dawn, naming constellations together under summer skies, watching as that small life mirrored her own wonder. Orion met her outside the clinic, arms wide. Thalia pressed herself into his embrace, feeling his heat steady her trembling form. "We're going to be parents," she whispered, as though saying the words aloud might break the spell. Orion's lips brushed her temple. "I've dreamed of this since the day I met you," he said. His voice caught. "I love you so much." They celebrated that afternoon with a picnic on the rooftop of Orion's studio. She wore loose trousers. Orion had laid out a blanket, cheese, fresh figs, and honey from a local apiary. A breeze drifted through the kiln room's open windows, bringing the soft scent of cedar and clay. They laughed and planned, talking about baby names, Elio for a boy, Luna for a girl, siblings maybe 2 years apart, picnics by the creek, bedtime stories under star lanterns. Those first weeks were a quiet dance of tenderness. Thalia and Orion tiptoed around the studio, careful not to jostle her changing body. He hung a tiny mobile of handcrafted ceramic stars above her favorite armchair. She tucked wildflower bouquets into every corner of their home. They watched documentaries about local wildlife, imagining teaching their child to track deer in the foothills or spot bald eagles in winter skies. Then, in the 5th week, things shifted. Thalia awoke one morning to a dull ache in her lower abdomen. At first, she brushed it off as normal growing pains. Women in her yoga studio had described similar twinges. But when the ache intensified, she sank to the bathroom floor, white tiles cold under her palms. Orion was at her side within seconds, his calm evaporating into concern. He swept her onto the bed, pressed cool compresses to her belly, and called the midwife they'd chosen. The midwife's soft voice guided them through those hours, when to seek emergency care, what signs to watch. Thalia's world narrowed to the ache in her belly and the racing of her own pulse. Words tumbled through her mind. Not yet, please not now, a silent plea as she stared at the ceiling. In the ER, a flurry of nurses ushered her into an exam room. Orion waited in the hallway's dim corridor, tapping his foot, jaw clenched. When the doctor emerged, his expression was cautious.
"I'm sorry,"
he said quietly. "It looks like a miscarriage has begun." The word struck Thalia like a lightning bolt. Miscarriage. Not just pain but loss. She slumped against the wall, breath catching in her throat. Orion was beside her in an instant, his hand trembling as he squeezed hers. They returned home in a fog of heartbreak. Thalia curled up on the sofa under a weighted blanket, tears soaking her pillow. Orion hovered, offering tea, fresh towels, gentle words. That life had a way of circling back to hope, but she couldn't hear past the thunder in her own mind. Days blurred. The euphoria of pregnancy gave way to a hollow ache. Thalia found herself avoiding mirrors. Her reflection, still the same face, the same eyes, felt foreign. Every morning she woke hoping it had been a dream, finding once more the dull reminder in her abdomen. To escape the suffocating quiet, she threw herself into work. The sunroom, once a bright nook for painting, became her refuge for design projects. She rearranged furniture, sketched new layouts for clients, researched sustainable materials at all hours. Orion would find her at dawn, coffee in hand, huddled over blueprints. She barely looked up. At the studio, Orion gently offered help, mixing glazes, loading kills, but Thalia preferred to lock herself in the sunroom office, where she could lose herself in spreadsheets and vendor calls. She'd signed on to redesign a boutique lodge on Mount Evans, complete with handcrafted ceramic fixtures. It was a dream project, one she couldn't afford to let slip, yet each design felt like both salvation and punishment, a reminder that life outside her grief marched on without pause. One afternoon, Orion entered the sunroom, brushing clay dust from his sleeves. He watched her hunched over her laptop, cursor blinking on an unfinished proposal. He waited until she noticed him. "You haven't slept much," he said, voice gentle but firm. She rubbed her temples. "I'll rest when this project is done." He shook his head. "This project can wait."
"I'm more worried about you."
Thalia's chest tightened. "I don't know how to be anything but busy right now." Orion stepped closer, placing his hand on hers. "I miss you." She looked up, startled by the raw ache in his eyes. "You can't fix this," she whispered, voice brittle. "No," he admitted, "but I can hold you." He gathered her into his arms, and for the first time since the miscarriage, Thalia let herself cry without apology. She wept for the child she'd barely known, for the future that had vanished, and for the fear that she would never recover. Orion held her until the storm inside her quieted to a soft tremor. That night, he lit a small fire in the hearth. The sunroom glowed with amber light, casting long shadows on her sketches. Orion and Thalia sat side by side on a sheepskin rug, wrapped in wool blankets. He reached into his pocket and produced the tiny ceramic sea star she'd given him on her first birthday, still his good luck charm. "I want to support you," he said gently, tracing the star's arms with his thumb. "But I need you to tell me what you need." Thalia stared into the flames, feeling their warmth seep into her bones. She realized she'd been pushing him away, trying to shoulder her grief alone. She pressed her hand to the sea star. "I need grace," she said, "and time. But I also need you." He nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Then we'll have both." In the days that followed, Thalia found small ways to breathe again. Orion left fresh daisies on her desk. They took short walks to Chautauqua Park, where she allowed herself to watch the foothills without thinking of loss. One evening, they sat on their porch swing, sharing a thermos of cocoa. Orion read aloud from her favorite poetry collection, a passage about resilience, and Thalia chuckled softly at the rhythm of his voice. Work still beckoned, but now she approached it in brief sprints, pausing to stretch, to step outside, to rest. She scheduled lunch dates with friends who reminded her of laughter, who told stories of ordinary triumphs that seemed extraordinary. And slowly, like the sun peeking back from behind clouds, Thalia felt her spirit lighten. The ache in her heart did not disappear. It became a quiet presence, a reminder of how deeply she could feel. But it no longer defined her. One crisp morning, she stood before her canvas for the first time in weeks. Paints waited in neat rows. Brushes lay beside a jar of cloudy water. Orion materialized at her side, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Ready?" he asked. Thalia nodded, her heart steady. She dipped a brush into teal pigment and pressed it to the canvas. Strokes unfurled in graceful arcs, like waves meeting shore. Orion watched in silence, a gentle smile on his face. In that palette of color and light, Thalia found her voice again, strong, cautious, but hopeful. She painted a sea star cradling a new form, half formed, half promise. It was imperfect, yet it held the essence of rebirth. She glanced at Orion. "Thank you," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "Always." And so they moved forward, navigating the silent tempest together, their hearts bearing both memory and possibility, knowing that grief, like clay in the kiln, could be shaped into something new and beautiful when guided by hands willing to heal. The small bell above the studio door tinkled in its familiar, comforting way as Thalia slipped inside one late morning, her fingers still stained with watercolor from the tea room mural she'd been commissioned to paint. She set her palette and brushes on a reclaimed wood shelf and paused, startled. A sleek travel mug sat on Orion's workbench, its surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. Next to it, a handwritten note read, "Good morning, Orion. Fuel for your work today, half decaf, half dark roast."
Love, Nyx.
Thalia frowned. She knew Orion rarely touched coffee on premises. He preferred the herbal teas she brought him. And Nyx? She'd never heard the name.
Moments latte.
Orion appeared from the kiln room, clay-dusted and contemplative. He noticed Thalia's puzzled expression and rose to join her. "That's from a new accountant, Nyx," he explained, rubbing his hands on his jeans. She insisted I let her send coffee sometimes. Thalia's heart tightened. The studio had hired Nyx 2 weeks ago to handle invoices and payroll, tasks Thalia herself had managed before the miscarriage sent her into workaholic overdrive. She'd barely spoken to Nyx beyond a perfunctory welcome aboard. Now, she realized, Nyx was planting herself into Orion's daily routine. "Half decaf, half dark roast," she repeated under her breath. "How well does she know your preferences?" Orion shrugged, picking up the mug and inhaling deeply. She asked one morning during orientation. I told her my usual light tea. She said she'd experiment. Thalia offered a tight smile. "Well, at least it's not another latte." He glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay?" "Just surprised," she said softly. "I didn't know she'd be that thoughtful." He returned to arranging fresh clay slabs for the next firing, and Thalia's mind churned. She'd felt vulnerable since returning from Orcas Island. Grateful for Orion's patience, but also raw, as if her heart were paper torn and pasted back together. Now, here was Nyx, pressing into their life with carefully measured gestures. Over the next few days, the travel mug appeared more frequently. Each morning, Thalia would find it in a different spot, on the shelf behind the slip-casting molds, on the windowsill overlooking the alley, even on Orion's drafting table beside his latest design sketches. The note's handwriting, looped and elegant, dangled on each mug like a silk ribbon. At first, Thalia told herself it was harmless. Nyx was simply eager to fit in, to show kindness. But then came the text. "Nyx. Hey, I noticed you in there. I have an extra cup, double chocolate chai. Want me to bring it by?" Smiley face. It arrived on Orion's phone just after he closed the studio door for the day. Thalia, passing behind him with an armful of glazed jars, caught the glow of the screen. Orion's thumb hovered over "yes, please," before he thought better of it and tapped "thanks, but I'm on my way home." Thalia's breath caught. She set down the jars and cleared her throat. "Who's Nyx?" she asked quietly, arms crossed. Orion's face fell. "She's my work contact, helps with billing. She's friendly." "And she texts you?" He massaged his temples. "It's nothing. Just coffee offers." "Right," Thalia said, turning away, voice tight. That evening, Thalia lay awake, the studio's silent clay kills ringing in her mind. She thought back to the first weeks of her and Orion's courtship, simple lunches, shared music playlists, stargazing on the porch swing. She'd never understood flirtation beyond a teasing text from a high school friend. But Nyx's careful attentions felt different, strategic, insistent. The next day, Thalia decided to observe. She arrived early at the studio, heart pounding, and hid behind a stack of plaster molds. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Nyx slipped in carrying 2 travel mugs, one for Orion, one for a coworker. She hummed softly, scanning the room. Orion emerged from the kiln room, reaching for a fresh apron. Nyx approached him with a smile that seemed to catch the lamplight in her auburn hair. "Morning, Orion," she said, handing him the mug. "I brew on Sundays. You'll get your regular blend today." Orion smiled, eyes warm. "You're too kind, Nyx." She glanced toward the door where Thalia was still hidden. Then, politeness shifting into something more intimate, she leaned forward. "I know how much you love to start your day right." He chuckled, taking a small sip. "It's perfect." Thalia felt a surge of alarm. The ease of their exchange pricked an unfamiliar knot of jealousy within her. She slunk out from behind the molds. "Thalia!" Orion exclaimed, startled. "You scared me." Nyx froze, mug midair. She placed it gently on the workbench and extended a hand. "Hi," she said, voice smooth. "I didn't realize you had company." Thalia forced a smile and shook it.
Good morning, Nyx.
"Nice coffee." Nyx's lips curved in what Thalia thought she detected as triumph, just for an instant, before she regained her composure. "Thanks," Nyx said. "Glad you like it." She turned back to Orion. "I'll see you later about those shipping labels." Then, without another glance at Thalia, she strode toward her own desk at the rear of the studio. Thalia opened her mouth to speak. But Orion placed a hand on her arm. "It's fine," he said softly. She was just being friendly. "Being friendly is one thing," Thalia replied, voice low. "But this feels targeted."
He sighed.
"I'll talk to her about boundaries." She nodded, uncertain if that would be enough. Over the next week, Nyx's presence grew. She would pop in with artisanal granola bars, homemade kale chips, and tales of her weekend mountain bike adventures. She'd peek over Orion's shoulder as he worked on new ceramic glazes, offering helpful suggestions on color contrasts. Each gesture was wrapped in warmth and sincerity, yet it all felt like a subtle campaign to occupy more of his time and thoughts. One afternoon, Nyx left a post-it on Orion's favorite kiln shelf. "I saw you sketching last night. Hope this brightens your day."
And
underneath lay a single sunflower, its petals dusted with pollen. Orion showed it to Thalia, eyebrows raised. "It's sweet,"
he said.
Thalia's chest tightened. "Is it?" Before he could answer, Nyx appeared with 2 iced lavender lattes. "Thought you might like a change," she said, setting one before each of them. Thalia forced polite thanks, but her gut nodded. She could see in Orion's eyes a flicker of apprehension, as though he recognized the line Nyx was edging toward but was unwilling or unable to redraw it. That night, Orion brought home the sunflower, awkwardly balanced between pottery boxes. "I'm going to talk to her tomorrow," he promised. Thalia didn't sleep. She mapped out every interaction in her mind, every deliberate smile, every casual touch, every mug left in a place only Orion would find it. The line between generosity and seduction blurred into a haze of cafe aromas and hand-scrawled notes. By early evening, Orion seemed tense, distracted by spreadsheets and studio lights. Finally, he closed his laptop. "I need to sort this out," he said, voice rough. Thalia nodded, relief and anxiety warring within her. They drove together to the studio under rolling clouds, the sky threatening its own deluge. Orion paused at the door. "Stay in the office," he said. "I'll handle this." Thalia obeyed, pressing her back against the door as she watched Orion stride toward Nyx's desk. Inside, she heard his voice, steady, calm. "Nyx, can we talk?" She caught snippets. Nyx's footsteps, the soft scrape of a chair, Thalia's own heart beating in her ears. A moment later, Orion emerged, shoulders squared. Nyx trailed behind him, eyes wide. Thalia stepped out. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Orion reached for her hand. "I told Nyx that her thoughtfulness is appreciated, but I'd prefer to keep coffee and personal messages just between us." Nyx bit her lip, expression a mix of apology and defiance. "I didn't realize. I thought we were friends. We can be co-workers," Orion said gently. "But let's maintain professional boundaries." Thalia studied Nyx's face, fresh, determined, and in that moment, something cool flickered behind her amber eyes. Nyx nodded, tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, and left without another word. Once the door clicked shut, Thalia exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Orion wrapped his arms around her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have said something sooner." She rested her head on his chest. "Thank you for saying it now." As the storm finally broke outside, rain sweeping across the studio windows, Thalia realized that this trial, this subtle tempest, had shown her how fiercely she cared for Orion, not just as a partner, but as the guardian of their shared life. She squeezed his hand. "Let's go home," she said, voice steady. "Together." And together they walked into the rain, leaving behind travel mugs, notes, and temptation in the quiet glow of the studio lights. It began with a single, innocuous ping at 2 a.m. Thalia stirred beside Orion in their shared loft, the soft glow of his phone screen cutting through the darkness like a lighthouse beam. For a moment, she thought it was her imagination, a leftover twitch of anxiety from the weeks with Nyx. Then she saw the text preview flicker. Nyx. "Hey, Orion, did you make it back safely? I snapped a pic of you outside the studio. Must have been a late night." "No worries, just making sure you're okay," smiley face. Thalia's heart stuttered. She felt the familiar knot of doubt tighten. Outside the studio? Late night? A photo? Orion shifted beneath her, groaning softly. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What time is it?" 2 a.m., Thalia murmured, voice small. He frowned and reached for his phone. Thalia hadn't seen his usual soothing ritual. No gentle do not disturb activated, no polite set for morning message. "Nyx," he muttered. He read the message. Thumb hovering over reply. Thalia's breath caught. "Who's Nyx?" she asked, voice hoarse. Orion glanced at her, still half asleep. "The accountant." "She... just checking if I got home safe." She sat up, clutching the covers. She snapped a picture? Outside the studio. Orion's brow knitted. "Yeah, she said I was still there after closing. I told her I'd left at 10, but maybe I forgot to flip my phone to silent." Thalia's chest tightened. She stared at the bedspread, imprinted with subtle waves of midnight blue, and tried to steady herself. "Did you spend the night there?" He swung his legs off the bed and rubbed his temple. "I was there late finishing glaze tests, but I went home. I promise." "Did you go home alone?" Her voice cracked. Orion paused, the ring of suspicion in her tone anchoring him fully awake. He sat next to her, hand instinctively brushing her hair from her face. "Yes," he said firmly. "I swear I was alone. I locked up around midnight, came here. You were asleep, so I didn't want to wake you." Thalia felt tears sting her eyes. The memory of Nyx's early morning note and orchid petals surfaced. Each small gift a stitch in this tapestry of doubt. She drew a shaky breath. "But she said she saw you outside. She messaged me, sent me that picture." Orion opened his phone's gallery. "Let's see it." Thalia scrolled back to the message thread. There it was, a dark, grainy photo of Orion's silhouette under a lamppost outside the studio, had bent over his phone as though he were sending a text. He wore his usual charcoal Henley and a paint-splattered jacket. His boots, dusted with clay, tapped the pavement. He studied the image. That was me, he said quietly. But I was alone. Look at the timestamp. It read 0:03, 3 minutes after midnight. Orion held the phone close to Thalia's face.
See?
I left just before you went to sleep. She leaned in. The photo was unmistakably of him. Yet it didn't answer whether he'd returned with someone or stopped at Nyx's desk first. Okay, Thalia whispered. But after that, where were you until morning? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I went home. I know it looked bad, but I was exhausted. I took the shortcut along the alley and… Shortcut, Thalia echoed. You go through the alley by the studio late at night? He shrugged. It's faster. Less traffic. Haven't you ever walked that way? She shivered at the thought of those shadowed bricks. Her voice trembled. I don't know what to believe anymore. Orion's eyes softened. He reached out, gathering her hands in his. Look, let's verify this. I can ask Tommy, his night shift driver. He was the one who drove me last night. He'll tell you I was the only passenger. Thalia's shoulders drooped. She nodded, tears brimming. Okay. Orion sat at the edge of the bed and dialed Tommy's number, his back to Thalia, so she could compose herself. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned. Tommy said he picked me up at the alley entrance around 12:10 a.m. No one else in the car but me. Thalia exhaled, relief and residual fear mingling. She sank against him. I'm sorry. He wrapped her in his arms. You have every right to worry. But the knot in Thalia's chest had grown tighter since she'd first glimpsed what she assumed was proof of Orion's betrayal. The realization that she'd doubted him so deeply wounded her more than any imagined betrayal. The next morning, she rose before dawn and brewed 2 mugs of chamomile tea, her compromise when coffee had become a battleground. She carried them to the studio, determined to see Nyx face to face. Orion trailed behind, watching her approach the glass front office, where Nyx worked. Through the window, she saw Nyx's back bent over a ledger. Thalia hesitated at the threshold, tea in hand. When Nyx looked up, surprise flickered in her hazel eyes. Thalia, here early. Thalia set a mug on Nyx's desk. Thought you might like some tea. A moment of silence passed. Then Thalia said, about last night's photo. Nyx's expression tightened. I sent it to Theo, Nyx's brother, who occasionally dropped by to pick up digital pay files, to let him know I was working late. Then I forwarded it to Orion, didn't even think. Why send it? Thalia's voice shook slightly. Why include me? Nyx looked away, shoulders straightening. I thought, maybe you'd worry too. I only meant to help. Thalia's heart ached. Instead, I spent the night terrified. Nyx swallowed.
I'm sorry.
I overstepped. Thalia met her gaze. We're vulnerable right now. Please respect that. Nyx nodded, pale. I understand. I won't send any more pictures or texts. Thalia placed a hand on her desk. Thank you. Then, as she turned to leave, Nyx added softly, I hope he's okay. Thalia paused. He's fine, she said quietly. Then she walked away, leaving Nyx alone with the unspoken tension of professional boundaries newly drawn. Back in the kiln room, Orion greeted Thalia with a cautious look. She stepped into his arms. It's done, she whispered. He held her tighter. I'm so sorry, love. She tilted her head back to meet his eyes. I believed you. But I need us to be honest, no more secrets, no matter how small. Orion pressed his forehead against hers. No more secrets. In the days that followed, Orion implemented clear boundaries. Nyx's coffee offered only in the break room by a communal pot, no after-hours texts or photos, nothing that could be misinterpreted. Thalia filled the studio's message board with cheerful post-it notes of her own. Coffee break at 10 and lunch in the park. Small invitations to collaboration that involve them both. Bit by bit, the undercurrent of suspicion ebbed. Trust, like clay in the kiln, required patient shaping and careful nurturing. Thalia and Orion sat side by side on a bench outside the studio one evening, watching the sun set over Boulder's peaks. Elated string lights blinked to life along Pearl Street. The city thrummed with life. Thalia let out a soft laugh. I think we just survived our first real storm. Orion smiled, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. And look how much stronger we are for it. She leaned into him, letting the residual tension slip away. Promise me we'll always handle things this way from now on. He kissed the side of her head. I promise. As darkness fell, they lingered there in each other's arms, a tether of honesty binding them ever closer, ready for whatever the next dawn would bring. The first hint came in the form of a scribbled note, slipped beneath the door of Orion's studio just after dawn. Thalia arrived early that Monday, determined to cement the boundaries they'd fought so hard to establish. But the cluttered workbench greeted her instead with a small, pink card printed in elegant script. Orion, I need to tell you something important. I'm pregnant. Beneath it lay a single white envelope stamped with private in gold foil. Thalia's pulse thundered. She picked up the card with shaking fingers, noticing a faint scent of vanilla and fresh paper. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, igniting every buried doubt. Inside the envelope was a crumpled ultrasound print, grainy gray and white, bearing a clinic's logo Thalia did not recognize. The image had been hastily cropped, so only the silhouette of a tiny gestational sac remained. No date, no names, nothing but that delicate curve floating in a sea of white. Her breath hitched. She turned to leave, but the studio door swung open, and there stood Nyx, pale but composed, her auburn hair catching the morning light. She didn't offer a smile. Instead, she held out her hands, card and envelope cupped between them. Thalia, Nyx said softly. Can we talk? Thalia's mind raced. In the days since their last confrontation, Nyx had treated them with respectful distance. No more late texts, no more surprise coffees. Thalia had begun to believe boundaries would hold. Now this. She tucked the card into her pocket and forced herself to speak calmly. What is this, Nyx? Nyx's green eyes glittered with something complex. Fear, determination, perhaps desperation. I need you and Orion to understand. I'm pregnant. I found out yesterday. Thalia's legs gave way. She sank onto a nearby stool, voice small. Pregnant. Nyx nodded, lip trembling. I've known for a week. I was afraid to tell you. I didn't want to cause a scene. But I can't keep this from him any longer. Thalia exhaled slowly, trying to steady her racing heart. Where's Orion?
She asked.
Working in the glaze room. Nyx's gaze flicked toward the back of the studio, where the kiln's dull orange glow pulsed. Thalia rose, her legs unsteady. She gripped the edge of a pottery wheel as she moved. Show me. Nyx led her through the narrow corridor between display shelves and unpacked boxes into the pastel-hued glow of the glaze room. There, at a low table, Orion crouched over a notebook, sketching color swatches. He didn't notice them until Thalia cleared her throat. He straightened and turned, confusion crossing his face. Thalia? Good morning. His eyes fell on Nyx, and then on the envelope in Thalia's hand. Nyx advanced, hands fluttering. Orion, I'm sorry to spring this on you, but I'm pregnant. Orion's brow furrowed. What, Nyx, that's... Thalia felt her blood run cold. She pressed the crumpled card against her chest. Is this true? She demanded, voice echoing off the glazed tiles. Nyx's shoulders sagged, and she held up the ultrasound print. This is from Dr. Langford's office in Bellingham. Orion held up a hand to halt her, eyes wide with shock. Bellingham? That's 100 miles from here. Nyx, did you take a test here? Nyx swallowed hard, gaze slipping to Thalia. I know. I went home last week and took it there. Thalia's mind whirled. But you initiated a meeting with him last Friday, after hours. She turned to Orion. You didn't tell me. Orion's face tightened. She came by with some end-of-week reports. I left at dusk. As Nyx opened her mouth to interject, Thalia flung the envelope onto the table, scattering Orion's sketches. That doesn't explain why you'd forge an ultrasound, show up here, and say you're pregnant with his child. Nyx's eyes glistened with tears. I didn't forge it. I got it from Dr. Langford. Thalia shook her head. No doctor prints out ultrasounds with no name, no date. This is a deception. Orion crossed to Thalia's side. Maybe there's another explanation. Thalia turned on him, hurt and rage flashing in her eyes. An explanation? Orion. She ambushed us. She weaponized my insecurities when I trusted her to stop. I asked for boundaries, and this is how she repays me. Nyx's breath came in sobs. I never meant to hurt you, Thalia. I was scared. I thought if I was pregnant. Scared of what? Thalia cut in. Of being alone? Of losing your job? Nyx shook her head.
No.
I thought if you knew I was carrying your... Orion's jaw clenched. My what? Thalia advanced on Nyx, voice low and cold. She thought if you believed she was pregnant by you, you'd commit to her. She'd captured you in her lie, so you'd abandon your life with me. Nyx's shoulders slumped. I'm sorry. Thalia's laughter was brittle, echoing off the high ceiling. Sorry isn't enough. Orion took Nyx gently by the arm. Let's step outside. He guided her toward the studio entrance. Thalia watched, heart hammering, as he led Nyx into the fading morning light.
Inside.
Thalia closed her eyes, pressing a shaking hand to her heart. The betrayal stung more deeply than any physical wound. She felt hollow. Her trust shattered again, this time by someone she'd tried to forgive. Outside, she heard Orion's voice, low and steady, telling Nyx firmly, this is done. You'll return the tests to Dr. Langford's office and transfer all documents to me by tomorrow. Then you'll hand in your resignation, effective immediately. Nyx's quiet sobs filtered through the door. Thalia's chest tightened with a mix of pity and disgust. When Orion returned, his face was pale. He closed the door softly behind him. Thalia turned, tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I never should have let this happen. Thalia swallowed hard, stepping away from the workbench. I asked you to protect us from secrets, from boundaries crossed. You did the right thing. But I feel like I lost you all over again. Orion reached for her, but she lifted a hand. I need time. He nodded, hurt flashing in his eyes. Take all the time you need. Thalia's vision blurred as she descended the narrow steps from the glaze room to the main gallery. Each pottery piece, once a symbol of Orion's patient artistry, now felt like witnesses to betrayal. She paused before a shelf of small ceramic birds, gifts Orion had made for her wedding anniversary. The birds stared back with glossy eyes, silent and quizzical, as though they too wondered how trust could fracture so suddenly. That night, Thalia lay awake in their loft, the empty space beside her like an echo. She replayed the morning's events over and over. The note, the ultrasound, Nyx's trembling confession, Orion's calm dismissal. How could someone weaponize a pregnancy? How had Nyx known just which buttons to push? Tears slipped down her cheeks as she remembered the laughter and soft mornings they'd shared on Orcus Island. She pictured Orion's face when he'd promised no more secrets, now soiled by falsehoods. The next afternoon, after a restless dawn, Thalia returned to the studio alone. She moved with purpose this time, to reclaim her space, to face the fragments of their life together. She washed the travel mugs and tossed Nyx's coffee blends, labeling the jar Studio Blend. She replaced Orion's sketches on the glazed table, smoothing the corners of the paper where her card had brushed. As she worked, she found clarity in routine, wiping down shelves, oiling the pottery wheels turning armature, arranging fresh clay. Each motion felt like a tiny act of healing, a reminder that she still had the strength to care for this shared dream. When Orion returned that evening, he found Thalia at her favorite workbench, hands covered in slip. She looked up, eyes steady but soft. "I'm sorry I stormed out," she said, voice hushed. "But I needed to feel grounded." He nodded, stepping quietly beside her. "I understand." She dipped her brush into a pool of glossy glaze. "I forgive Nyx. But not yet. I need time to forgive her.
And you?
I need time to trust again." Orion placed his hand over hers, glaze dripping between their fingers. "I will wait." They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, letting the sun set behind the overhead skylight. Dust motes drifted in the amber glow while their shared dream, wrought in clay and fire, waited for renewal. And though the path forward would be slow, Thalia knew that if they held to honesty and patience, the fragile vessel of their love could be reshaped, stronger than before. In the kiln of their relationship, this betrayal would be the hottest trial yet. But after the final firing, they would emerge, and perhaps, in that transformation, discover a new depth of devotion that no deception could destroy. The following morning, a crisp clarity settled over Boulder as Orion and Thalia drove in silence toward the family law clinic on 28th Street. The early sun glittered off the flatirons, but Thalia's heart remained heavy with the memory of Nyx's desperate confession. Orion gripped her hand in the passenger seat, a silent anchor. They arrived at the clinic and were ushered into a small consultation room by a stern-faced technician named Sandra. The walls were painted a soothing dove gray, and a desktop scanner hummed quietly on the counter. 2 sealed envelopes lay waiting, one marked Orion A. Sterling, the other Nyx Marlowe. "Just place your samples here," Sandra instructed, gesturing to 2 small vials already labeled. Orion and Nyx each lifted a swab to their cheeks, swirled it inside for the instructed time, then handed the vials back. The technician nodded, sealing them in a tamper-evident bag. "Results will be ready by mid-afternoon." Outside, Thalia and Orion found Nyx waiting in the crisp hallway. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight braid, her cheeks pale. She avoided Thalia's eyes, folding and refolding her hands. I'm sorry," Nyx said, voice trembling. "Thank you for doing this." Thalia forced a calm nod. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Back in their loft hours later, the tension was palpable. Orion worked at the studio bench while Thalia paced, stopping every few moments to peer out the window at the sky's shifting hues. At last, her phone buzzed, a secure text from the clinic. "Your DNA results are in." Orion set down his tools, exhaling. "Shall we?" They returned to the clinic. Sandra greeted them with an apologetic smile. "The results are straightforward. Mr. Sterling, you and Ms. Marlowe are not genetically related in the way you feared." She placed each envelope on the counter. "You can open them together." Orion and Thalia exchanged a glance before carefully pulling out their letters. Orion's letter confirmed his DNA profile. Nyx's confirmed hers. They compared notes. Then Sandra handed them the paternity form. Beneath the clinic header, the box marked father was blank. Nyx's breath caught. It's not his." Tears sprang in her eyes as she slid to her knees beside Orion and Thalia in the waiting area. Her braid unraveled and fell over one shoulder. She clasped her hands, as though in prayer. "Thalia." "Orion," Nyx began, voice cracking, "I owe you both the truth." She bowed her head. Thalia knelt to meet her, at eye level. "Start at the beginning." Nyx took a shuddering breath. "I was lonely, fresh out of college, away from family, struggling to find my place. I looked up to Orion. He was safe, steady, the kind of person you could count on. And in a moment of weakness, I wondered what it would feel like to make him need me." Orion's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting Nyx continue. "I devised a test," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I planted the idea of pregnancy to see if he would choose me over everything else. I thought if he couldn't resist, I'd prove my worth." Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her own hands. But it was a lie. A cruel, selfish lie. Thalia's throat fluttered. The ache of betrayal resurfaced, but she pressed a hand to her heart and exhaled slowly. Nyx's gaze flicked to Orion, tears spilling down her cheeks. I saw how he treated Thalia, how he loved her. It made me hate myself. I'm so sorry. Orion rose and offered Nyx a hand up. She took it, trembling. Thalia stood as well, folding her own arms. The three formed a quiet triangle under the clinic's fluorescent lights. I forgive you, Thalia said, voice soft but firm. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to let go of this anger.
She met Nyx's eyes.
Don't ever do this again. Nyx nodded, tears glistening. Never. You have my word. I will resign tomorrow and leave Boulder for good. Orion stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Nyx's shoulder. Thank you for telling the truth, and for accepting the test. He turned to Thalia and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. As they walked outside into the afternoon sun, the air felt lighter, as though the lie had evaporated in the daylight. Thalia breathed deeply, tasting the possibility of renewal. Back at the studio, Thalia stacked the ultrasound print and Nyx's pink card in the recycling bin. Orion closed the kiln door behind him, the echo sounding like finality. That evening, as dusk settled, Orion and Thalia returned home. Over tea on their porch swing, they spoke quietly of boundaries rebuilt and trust regained. The fragile vessel of their love had been cracked, but they would mend it together. In the hush of night, Thalia leaned her head on Orion's shoulder. Thank you for standing by me. Orion kissed her temple. Always. And as the stars emerged overhead, Thalia felt the weight of deception lift at last, leaving behind only the steadfast glow of truth and a love strong enough to endure its severest tests. The morning light filtered gently through the mullioned windows of Thalia and Orion's loft, scattering warm patterns across the hardwood floor. For the first time in weeks, Thalia awoke without the weight of suspicion pressing on her chest. Instead, she felt a cautious stirring of hope, a sense that what was shattered could be made whole again. In the kitchen nook, Orion had already started today's ritual, a pot of ginger, lemon tea simmering on the stove, steam curling in lazy spirals. He glanced up as Thalia descended the stairs, concern softening into relief at the sight of her calm expression. Morning, he said, setting 2 mugs on the table, one adorned with a hand-painted sea star, the other with a tiny ceramic wave. Morning, Thalia replied, accepting the mug etched with a wave. Thank you. They fell into a comfortable silence, sipping tea and watching the sky shift from pale gold to bright amber. This small act, sharing a morning beverage, felt like a renewed promise. After breakfast, Thalia retrieved a small wooden box from the bedroom dresser. She carried it into the studio where Orion was arranging fresh slabs of porcelain clay. The box's lid bore their intertwined initials, T Heart Pseudo, etched in Orion's flowing script. What's this? He asked, curious. Thalia opened the box to reveal 2 simple bands of white gold inside, one slightly larger, one smaller to fit their respective fingers. Each ring was engraved on the inside, reforged on hers, unbroken on his. I wanted something to mark this moment, Thalia explained, voice steady, to show that even after cracks appear, we can refire our bond into something stronger. Orion's breath caught. He took her hand and slid the smaller ring onto her finger. It settled perfectly, a cool weight that felt reassuring rather than confining. Then he lifted her other hand and fitted on his ring. These are perfect, he whispered, brushing his thumb over the engraved word. Thank you. They stood together in the soft light, the hum of the kills a distant echo. Thalia felt the full gravity of what they'd endured, betrayal, doubt, deception, transforming into resilience. With these rings, they sealed their commitment to transparency and trust. As afternoon settled, they decided to honor their renewed bond with a ritual of creation. Orion led Thalia to the communal workbench, where he'd prepared 2 lumps of fresh clay. He handed her a simple wooden tool. Let's make something together, he suggested. A keepsake. Thalia nodded, dipping her fingertips into the cool, pliable clay. Orion did the same. They shaped two halves of what would become a single sculpture, interlocking forms that curved and spiraled around each other, symbolizing their lives, distinct yet inseparable. They worked in companionable silence, hands moving in tandem. Occasionally, Orion would press a gentle finger into Thalia's clay, smoothing a rough edge. She'd smile and return the gesture, carving a playful swirl near his spiral. Bits of clay dusted their sleeves and joined the scattering of petals and broken kiln shards on the floor. When the piece took shape, a pair of entwined waves, they stood back to admire it. The sculpture felt alive with their combined energy, Thalia's sweeping arcs, Orion's attentive details. "That's beautiful," Orion said softly. Thalia leaned against him. "It's ours." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Like us." They slid the sculpture onto a wooden board at the front of the studio, where each visitor would see it. A testament to love tested by fire and reshaped by intention. That evening, they returned home to prepare a humble dinner together. Thalia chopped vegetables with practiced precision while Orion sautéed garlic and herbs in olive oil. Soft jazz played on the small radio, a playlist Thalia had curated, featuring songs about renewal and second chances. As they sat down to eat at their little dining table, Orion raised his glass of Pinot Noir. "To new beginnings," he toasted. Thalia clinked her glass against his.
"To us."
They ate slowly, savoring the simple meal and each other's company. The flicker of candlelight danced in their eyes, illuminating the quiet joy that had reclaimed their hearts. After dinner, Orion surprised Thalia with one more gesture. He set aside his wine glass, then returned with a folded piece of parchment tied with a narrow ribbon. "What's this?" she asked, intrigued. He handed it to her. "A contract." Thalia laughed, recalling the tense legal agreements of the morning's DNA test. She untied the ribbon. Inside was a handwritten agreement, less formal than the clinic's paperwork, more heartfelt. The Sterling Harper Covenant. "We, Thalia and Orion, vow to honor truth above all, to speak openly even when unguarded, and to cherish each small moment of grace. We commit to hold each other's hearts with hands both gentle and brave, forging our love anew each day." Thalia's eyes brimmed with tears as she looked up at Orion. "You did this." He nodded, voice soft. "Your words once carried me through my darkest times. Now it's my turn to craft words for us, so we always remember what matters." She wiped her eyes and folded the parchment carefully. "I'll sign it." Fetching her favorite fountain pen, she wrote her name beneath Orion's, then passed the pen back. He signed with a flourish. They sealed the covenant with a kiss, tender and assuring. In that moment, the past's sharp edges dulled, and only the steady glow of their promise remained. Over the next days, they wove new rhythms into their life. They instituted a nightly debrief, 20 minutes before bed, to share thoughts, anxieties, and appreciations. They installed a small message board in the studio's entryway where they left each other notes, reminders to drink water, doodles of sea stars, lists of small joys. On weekends, they resumed their morning walks through Chautauqua Park, where laughter came easily and conversation meandered from art projects to stargazing plans. In the evenings, they returned to the pottery wheel together, co-creating pieces that bore the subtle fingerprints of both. Their hands occasionally brushed, and they'd pause to smile at one another, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd taken. One clear night, they set up a pair of vintage camping chairs on the rooftop terrace, bundled in blankets, while sipping hot cider. Orion pointed out the constellation Cassiopeia, tracing its W shape with his finger. Thalia leaned close, resting her head on his shoulder. "Remember when I first painted Cassiopeia for your kiln shop sign?" she asked. Orion chuckled. "How could I forget? My first custom order for my favorite artist." They laughed softly, gazing at the stars that had witnessed every step of their story, joys, heartaches, and now renewal. When they finally turned in for the night, Thalia curled into Orion's arms. Aware of a profound truth, Love was not only the spark of first attraction, but the patient work of tending embers, rekindling light where shadows had fallen. And in that peaceful hush, as their rings glinted softly on the bedside table, Thalia drifted to sleep secure in the knowledge that their union, though once fractured, had been reforged stronger than ever before. The days that followed bore the gentle steadiness of a river finding its course after a storm. Thalia and Orion moved through their lives with deliberate care. No grand gestures, no sweeping proclamations, just a rhythm of small kindnesses and shared silences that spoke louder than any words. In those quiet moments, they discovered the true measure of love. Not in the fireworks of passion, but in the steady flame of trust and patience. One afternoon, they found themselves in their favorite spot atop the rooftop terrace, where the panorama of Boulder's foothills stretched into the distance. The air was crisp with early autumn's promise. Leaves had just begun to turn. Orion had set out 2 steaming mugs of spiced apple cider and a well-worn copy of Rumi's poetry. Thalia settled beside him on a plush blanket, pulling the hem of her sweater over her wrists. They read together, taking turns aloud. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Thalia closed the book and leaned against Orion's shoulder. "I think this past year has shown me how true that is." He nodded, tracing lazy circles on her hand. "We both emerged stronger after our wounds. We chose not to let betrayal and doubt define us." She turned to him, eyes reflective. "It took patience to forgive. It took courage to trust again. But I've learned that love isn't a single moment, it's a practice." Orion offered her the cider, and she sipped gratefully. The spice warmed her from the inside out, much like the knowledge that they had navigated their darkest hours together. "Trust," he said softly, "is like a wild bird. You can't cage it, you can only offer it a place to nest day after day." Thalia smiled at his metaphor. "And patience is the song you sing to coax it down from the branches." They lapsed into companionable silence, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, petals of rose gold fading to lavender twilight. In that hush, they reaffirmed what mattered most: honesty in speech, openness in heart, and the willingness to meet each other's vulnerabilities with kindness rather than judgment. When the first stars blinked awake, Thalia rose and retrieved their entwined wave sculpture from inside the studio. She placed it on the terrace ledge, where moonlight would cast dancing shadows across its smooth curves. "It reminds me," she said, stepping back, "that our lives might have separate forms, but together we make a single work of art." Orion joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "A work that can bend without breaking, that can learn from the heat of the kiln and grow more resilient." Thalia nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "May we always remember that." They stood like that until the chill drove them inside. Later, nestled in bed, Thalia reflected on how far they'd come. She thought of the first tentative days of their engagement, the brightness of their honeymoon mornings, the heartbreak of loss, the shadow of Nyx's deception, and finally the gradual rebirth of their union. Each chapter had tested them and ultimately taught them that the truest love is never flawless, but it can be steadfast. As sleep threatened to carry her away, she whispered her own promise. "I will tend this love every day, Orion. I will honor your heart as you have honored mine." He squeezed her hand and replied, "And I will honor yours, always." In the quiet that followed, Thalia understood that their covenant was not a one-time sealing, but an ongoing choice. Each morning would bring decisions: to listen rather than react, to share rather than withhold, to rebuild rather than retreat. And so long as they held to these simple truths, their love would endure, rooted not in perfection, but in patience and trust. Outside, the world turned as it always had. Seasons shifted, stars wheeled overhead, mountains stood silent witness. And in the heart of their home, 2 souls walked forward together, guided by the heart's quiet wisdom. That love, tested by fire, can emerge not only unbroken, but stronger, more luminous, and infinitely more cherished than before. And that brings us to the end of today's story on Truistery Vibes. Don't forget to leave a comment with a quote or moment that touched you the most. Your words give our team the motivation to keep creating more heartfelt stories. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.